things to get right on the test. Characteristics of money, functions of money, true, false. Money is legal tender. False, money is whatever people use in exchange. It may or may not be legal tender. So we're going to talk about, did you guys have D, the types of money? That's the last thing. So I'm going to talk about E under this, although we're going to go away from this. We're not going to use this criteria, this outline form for a while here, because we're going to do a bunch of charts. So we're going to talk about banks in the money supply process. And the first thing we're going to do is make some assumptions to make our life easier. Now we're going to relax these assumptions. And it's going to make our life harder when we relax them. But to start out, we need to have these assumptions to make our life easier. We're going to assume one bank. I don't know, what bank should we call it? SVB. Maybe we'll call that our one bank. I always like to pick a bank that's been in the news. Silicon Valley Bank, famous for doing what?
Going bankrupt.
Going bankrupt, yeah, so. With a lot of rich people's money in it. A lot of rich people over the insurance threshold, so of course, it was rich people, not poor people over the threshold, they paid it all. Which they shouldn't have, probably. So we got one bank, I'll call it SVB. People hold no cash. The bank holds no excess reserves. And I don't know, Moses came down from the mountain, and on the back of the tablet, it says banks shall hold 10% reserve on deposits. Whatever. We don't have a central bank yet, so we don't know where this came from, so I'll make it come from God. 10% required reserve. But it had to come from someplace. So, and I guess I gotta assume some money. My father's been dead a long time now, so he's not as good an example, but my long-time example has been my father died. When he died, he was either gonna have hundreds of thousands of dollars in debts, or hundreds of thousands of dollars of cash stuffed in the wall someplace. He was a bit of a hoarder. So I assumed we found it, my sisters found it, and went to the bank and put the money in the bank. Whatever, $100,000 shows up from someplace. $100,000, it's sort of, people hold no cash, so that sort of violates that assumption. But all of a sudden, I saw this picture the other day of, I didn't read the article, but of a rainstorm in Dubai from seeding the clouds, right? In theory, if they could, there are things you could do to seed the clouds to get rain when it's not raining, and I guess in theory there are things you could do to steer a hurricane someplace. So, but at least in Dubai, you know, I can see in the desert why you're not trying. But let's say $100,000 fell from heaven in your backyard and you went to the bank immediately because you hold no cash. So we got $100,000 in new money. Right, so, I don't know, it could fall in the bank's backyard and they put it in their vault. Or you get it in your backyard and put it in the vault. So, we've got a bank, right? Silicon Valley Bank. It's got some assets and some liabilities. So, what's it at? What's its assets?
Your loans.
It's got the $100,000. And that asset is cash. We won't worry about what it had previously. And it's got a liability. $100,000 in deposits. That belongs to my sister, you, whoever the $100,000 fell in their backyard. So, I need some abbreviations, so I'm going to start them over here. We're going to call C cash. We're going to call D deposits. Well, let's call it transactions or checking deposits. All right. Do we have a happy bank? Is this a happy bank? Right? From an accounting point of view, I guess it's happy, right? Its assets equal its liabilities, like has to be the case. But is it happy? No. Why is it not happy?
It's not making money.
Well, it's not making money. That's more sophisticated than we're getting into. By the way, I got assets on the correct side, liabilities on the correct side. Is that right? Accounting majors, or at least people who have taken accounting classes. Am I good? Anybody? No? I didn't take a lot of accounting. I didn't take any accounting classes. Because I was an arts and sciences major in economics, and like you nurses, it doesn't matter which side I put it on. But the business students, right, you should care whether I get assets. That'll confuse you if I get them on the wrong side. So, now, what are the liabilities? $100,000 in deposits. And what are the assets? $10,000 in required reserves. And $90,000 in excess reserves. So, what's the bank to do? As he said, the bank is also unhappy because they're not making any money. They gotta start making money. So, who has the oldest non-classic car here? Who has the oldest non-classic car? What? 2000. 2000. Can anybody beat 2000? Anybody got a car from the last millennium? Is it a classic or is it just a beat up old truck?
It's just a beat up truck.
Okay, you think you need a new truck? Anybody beat 94? You're saying. Okay, so you need something new. What are you gonna get?
I probably would just use the truck I got, the other one I got.
That doesn't help. This is an example. This is a fun experiment.
And I probably would get some early, 2010.
You're getting a new truck, okay? What new truck do you want? Okay, let's try it this way. Given that I have to get rid of $90,000 damn dollars, what new truck do you want?
GMC diesel truck.
A GMC diesel truck, what's it sell for?
They range from anywhere from 50,000 used to up to about 9,000 new.
90,000 new, okay. Can you turn it into 110,000? Can you get enough bells and whistles?
Easily.
Okay, so let's say he puts enough bells and whistles on it. He takes in your 94 what?
94 truck. I think it's a Ranger. I don't really know.
A 94 Ranger. So you take in your 94 Ranger to the GMC dealership. Who sells the GMCs? Yeah, I know Chevrolet. It could be any of them, General Motors, but who has it?
Locally, I have no idea.
No idea, nobody knows. Anyway, you take it to the UJ Chevrolet, let's say. All right, they offer you $20,000 for your truck, conveniently. Does that seem like a good deal as a trade-in? Your truck worth $20,000?
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, that's a great deal. Okay, so you get a $90,000 loan. So what happens? They make a $90,000 loan to you. And well, let's start here. So, our bank makes a $90,000 loan to you. Do they give you $90,000 in cash? No. What do they give you?
Cashier's check.
They probably don't give you a cashier's check either. What do they give you?
Probably a credit for 9,000.
They probably give you a $90,000 checking account. And in fact, in the car business case, what do? They transfer that checking account. You never really get it. They sort of, it's really interesting. I noticed something. I bought a car in the last spring from and used the South Alabama Credit Union to finance it. And I noticed on my statement, I'd never noticed this before, they take the money right out of my check. But they actually take the money out of my check, put it in my account, and then pay for the car. For accounting purposes, I'm sure, right? I mean, it doesn't matter to me how they do it. But for accounting purposes, the bank, I don't know whether the bank would actually create a dummy account for you and then transfer the dummy account to them, but what happens is, ultimately, somebody ends up with a $90,000 checking account, a $90,000 deposit. So we're here at Silicon Valley Bank, assets and liabilities. So now the bank has $100,000 in cash. It's got the original $100,000 deposit. Now it's got a $90,000 loan. This is good because why? Now they can start paying their employees, right? They're at least making something. They probably were too, because there are other things. This is just the addition to the bank balance sheet that we're doing. And they've got a $90,000 deposit. The new deposit created by the car loan. Is this a happy bank? Anyone? Is it a happy bank? Well, it's now got $190,000 in deposits. It's got $100,000 in cash. And a $90,000 loan. We're balanced as we need to be, but what's true? It's now got $190,000 in deposits, meaning it's got $19,000. Where did I get the 19,000?
10%.
10%. Why did I use 10%, not 25% or 20% or et cetera?
You have to have 10%.
God said-
That's the assumption, yeah, God said so. Okay, on your test, God doesn't say 10%, sometimes it's different. Right, if you've looked at the old tests. So, we got required reserves of 19,000, $81,000 of excess reserves, and our $90,000 loan. So, who has the closest birthday to today in here? When's your birthday?
It was yesterday.
Anybody beat yesterday? Anybody's birthday tomorrow? All right, who gives you the best birthday presents? Who gives you the best birthday presents?
I have an anniversary tomorrow.
I haven't done anniversaries because there's so few people married in my classes usually. You give yourself the best birthday presents, don't you really? I mean, in reality, who gives you the best birthday presents? Maybe a few. Often empty. So you're gonna get yourself something for your birthday. What are you gonna get? What are you gonna get yourself? Given that I have to give away $81,000, what are you gonna get yourself for your birthday?
A car.
So you want a car too? Could have been diamonds. We've looked up the price of diamonds on the internet before in this class, but she says car, so we'll used to go with condos, but you can't get a beach condo for $100,000 anymore around here.
Get a time.
Car. So what kind of car do you want?
Camry.
That's a responsible choice.
I'm sorry. Maybe I wasn't clear. Given that I have to get rid of $81,000, what car do you want?
You could get 2 Camrys for that.
Oh, no, the new ones.
What's a Camry cost? 40?
The new ones can
If
be.
it's loaded, about 32.
32?
I mean, about 32. Yeah. Not loaded.
But you can't get a Lamborghini anymore for $81,000.
Yeah.
How about a top and blind Lexus? Since you're a Toyota. Okay, so, all right, so anyway, we're gonna do the trade-in. She's gonna get the, so what's gonna happen to our bank here? So now we're gonna have what? $271,000 in deposits. Where did I get that number? We traded in her car. She spent $81,000 above the trade-in, whatever it was, for whatever car she got. Where did I get $271,000 in deposits? Anyone? I took this number and added in the new loan, $81,000. And that means we have 100,000 in cash, but our 100,000 in cash can be broken down into what? $27,100 in required reserves, $82,900, no, that can't be. $72,900 in excess reserves. Is that 100,000? Yes, it is. And we got a $90,000 loan, and now we got an $81,000 loan. So we got $171,000 in loans. So I sort of skipped a couple of steps there. Is the bank happy? Are you happy to skip the rest of this and just do the algebra now that we've gotten into hundreds of dollars? Because what's going to happen next? Tens of dollars, etc. We could do this almost for, well, we could do it forever. You know, we're never going to, it's one of these things that where you never quite get there, but with algebra you can. What do we know? What do we know? We have $100,000, right? And for this bank to be happy under our assumptions, what must happen? What must happen to that $100,000? For it to stop loaning, what's got to happen? When would we stop? In our example, if we kept doing these, I tediously went through all of
So
them.
when the person who put the 100,000 in takes it out?
No,
Until you have no more excess reserve.
until essentially there's zero excess reserves. So what has to happen for there to be zero excess reserves? What has to happen for there to be zero excess reserves? The $100,000 must all become what? Required reserves, right? And what has happened? We started off with $10,000 in required reserve. We already got up to $27,000. So then our $100,000 must equal deposits times our required reserve. And our required reserve is 0.1, right? So deposits must equal $100,000. I don't know, we economists sometimes put decimal places underneath fractions. The mathematicians want to yell about that. If we turn that decimal, what is 10%? What, in fraction terms, what is it? 1 over 10. So if we turn it into 1 over 10, what do we know about reducing that fraction? How do you reduce it? What could you do to a number and not change its value? There are 4 things you can do to a number and not change its value. What are they? You can add or subtract 0. You can multiply or divide by 1. Right, so we're going to multiply this number by 1. 10 over 1 divided by 10 over 1. Does everybody agree that 10 over 1 divided by 10 over 1 is a well-known form of the number 1? Anything divided by itself is what? 1, right? Everybody understand that? So that nicely cancels out the bottom. That's why you say when you do these kinds of problems, what? Since you forgot this since they, and I forgot it too till I started teaching it. Right? Way back in 8th grade or maybe 6th grade, they said they taught you this and you learned to invert and multiply. So you invert and multiply, but what you're really doing is multiplying by 1. When we get deposits equal $1 million. So, if we had $1 million in deposits, then we would have $900,000 in loans, and, well, right, we'll go to this place. $10% of $1 million is what? $100,000. And why do we know it's $900,000 in loans at the end? Because that original deposit was not a loan, it was just a cash found, showed up at the bank. So, I don't know, maybe you're unlucky. Maybe your kids or their kids will get to come to economics class, and we can stop right here. Because nobody will hold cash, nobody will spend cash anymore. But right now, what's true? We gotta relax some of those assumptions. And if you would like to do well on the next test, what should you do? Tonight, probably. Probably after this class, but not right now. You should probably go look at that figure that has a bank T-chart and see if you can answer those while they are fresh in your mind. And the biggest thing is gonna be figuring out what the required reserve ratio is. It's different, it's not gonna be 10, I don't think it's 10% on the one I sent you. All right, well, we're gonna relax the assumptions we made a little bit later. I did see somebody, I know this is not, really not that much news, but I did see someone showing their ignorance on X or Twitter over the weekend, saying, do you think the feds will lower rates? I responded, I didn't think the FBI was able to lower the crime rate, especially since they're committing a bunch of crimes, but that's another matter. But, some people got it, right? Who are the feds? The FBI, Secret Service, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, etc. We now need to switch. We talked about banks. We know how banks are involved in the money supply process. We're going to talk about how the Fed is involved in the money supply process. And I guess first maybe we should talk about a central bank and what a central bank does. So we're going to talk about a central bank functions. And one thing they do is regulate commercial banks. or maybe I should say depository institutions. Right? We've seen now that banks are special. How are banks special? They can create money. They can create means of transactions, medium of transactions. Right? They got $100,000 in cash, created another $90,000 worth of deposits that people can spend on things. That makes them different than mutual funds, makes them different than the stock market, makes them different than a lot of other financial institutions. So, the central bank regulates, the first one is to regulate commercial banks. The second one is acting as a lender of last resort. In a bank panic. That is keeping the bank system going. In our example, our bank had how much cash on hand at the end? $100,000. How much could people come and get out of the bank? $1 million. Now it had these loans, and if all of a sudden people felt this bank wasn't very safe, they could sell off these loans and maybe get close to the $1 million. That's the value of those loans. The book value of the loans would be the other $900,000. So maybe they'd be okay. But if everybody tries to go to all the banks at once and all the banks are dumping their loans on the market, what's going to happen to the price of the loans? It's going to go down. The amount you can sell them for is going to go down. And so there's some danger in the whole system collapsing because all banks are always illiquid. That was his complaint early on when I kept saying, is this bank happy? And he kept saying no, because they don't have any loans. Well, they were liquid. He may or may not have known that that's what he was saying, but he was saying, you're saying this bank is too liquid because it can't make anything. But by making something, then it's illiquid. It's got these loans. You know, if you go to the bank, can they write you out a piece of paper and say, here, we'll give you your percentage of your deposits of this loan? You go collect from this other person? No, that's not how it works. So, but not insolvent. Not insolvent, not broke, unless everybody tries to sell their loans at once again. Right? You're at the Final Four. A quarter of the crowd. Well, actually, let's say it's at the end of the second game. Second game is gone. 100% of the crowd paid a lot of money for the tickets. And you have left a ticket to the final game. What's true about half the crowd?
I don't want to go to the final game.
Their team's not in the final game, right? So what happens to the price of tickets to the championship game immediately after the second game? Really, it happens twice, after the first game and after the second game. The price goes way down, because all of a sudden there are a lot more people willing to sell. Same thing is true if you've got a bunch of, if your assets are loans, well, that's great until you have to sell them all at once. So they act as a lender of last resort in a bank panic. And that's an important thing. Whenever there's stress on the banks, the central bank is supposed to step in and relieve that stress. The stock market one day, I don't know, maybe it was in the eighties or nineties, I don't remember, fell 20% or something in one day, greater than the one in 1929. The Fed just put out a bunch of money. For one thing, there were still people alive who had lived through 1929, or their parents had, and a lot of those people did what when the stock market crashed that day? Took cash out of the bank and put it in the safe deposit box, buried it in their backyard. So you've got to replace that cash to keep the system liquid. And the last one is setting the money supply. Or defending the exchange rate. If you set the money supply, what must you do about the exchange rate? Let it to go whatever buyers and sellers want to make the exchange rate. If you're on a gold standard or have a fixed exchange rate regime that you're committed to being, then what has to happen? You have to supply the amount of cash to the market that the market wants at that exchange rate. There's some amount of money that if you put it in the market as a central bank, you'll get the exchange rate to stay at the fixed exchange rate. So you can do one or the other, you can't do both. That's what central banks in general do. What the name of the U.S. central bank is the Fed. So, what's unusual about the U.S. government? How is the U.S. government different from a lot of other ones, although we sort of set up the same kind of government in Germany after World War II? We foolishly didn't do that in Iraq. Maybe we would have been better to do that. What's the outstanding characteristic of the U.S. government? Anyone? What's different than the UK? Different than Iraq?
It's a two-party system.
Hmm?
It's a two-party system.
Well, that's it. You know, it has evolved into a two-party system, but that's not really part of the structure itself. It could be multi-party. Maybe we'll see. Maybe RFK Jr. will get 25% of the vote this time. I don't know. You know, he's in double digits in a lot of polls, so we'll see. And there's going to be, right when you get your ballot, there's going to be at least 5 candidates on it this time. Well, I don't know about Alabama. I'm pretty sure there'll be a libertarian candidate in Alabama. There always is. Is there always a Green Party candidate? Anybody remember?
Ohio may be missing Biden on the ballot.
Oh, we don't want to get into that. So,
I know in Arizona they're doing the Green Party, but I don't know if that's anywhere else.
well, they're going to be on a bunch of states, but, you know, the question is, you know, on our ballot, how many guys will be on there? The outstanding characteristic of the United States government is federalism. way back in the day when I first moved here, for maybe the first half of the time I've lived in here, there was a town between here and Hattiesburg, between here and the Mississippi line by the name of, was it Wilmer? I think Wilmer.
There is still.
There still is? It's not
It's
Wilmer.
unincorporated.
Oh, okay, yeah, there was this town called Wilmer. They had a speed trap. Speed traps aren't all that popular. People of Alabama decided they didn't like Wilmer having a speed trap. What did they do? What did our legislators do? Pass a law, no more Wilmer. No longer exists. States, on the other hand, are like nations, right? You may know from your history there have been times that Alabama didn't get along that well with the national government. What did the national government do? Nationalized the Alabama National Guard, federalized the Alabama National Guard, send troops in or something like that, right? What didn't they do?
My son's federalized right now.
Right, but that's for an overseas
Yeah.
thing.
No,
But why,
Texas,
oh, is it for the tech, okay.
yeah.
But, what didn't they do? They didn't say, no more Alabama. Because, you know, and it's sort of a myth, I mean, it's a man-made myth, but we treat these states like they're sovereign. Just like we treat countries like they're sovereign. Of course, you're a sovereign country until what happens? Somebody takes you over, right? Right, parts of Ukraine are part of the sovereign country of Ukraine till Russia takes them. What's the part that they took during the Obama administration? Crimea, yeah, that's. So, why do we have federalism in the United States, do you suspect? We are a country historically suspicious of centralized power. So, we went to set up a Federal Reserve. And really, if you go back in history, we had sort of early central banks. Before Andrew Jackson and after Andrew Jackson, there were the first Bank of the United States and the second Bank of the United States. And they were quasi-central banks. They at least did the first part. And maybe the third part a little bit. They regulated the banks and maybe defended the exchange rate some by, what they would do is they would go and take the banknotes to banks periodically from time to time and say, here, give us the gold or the silver. Actually gold in the case of the U.S. They presented the banknotes at the bank and said, where's the backing? And so that made banks keep enough on hand so that they could meet demands such as that. There weren't any legal required reserves or anything. And the further a note got away from the bank, the more it circulated at a discount. And I guess at the time there were pictures. There were books with pictures in them where you could look up notes to see what they were selling at. There was a time, before you guys were born, when they had books of credit card numbers that were no good, and they would look up your credit card number to make sure your credit card was good. It didn't last very long. But, so we set up a central bank, but it had 12 reserve banks. And it was set up, first of all, it was set up at a really inopportune time. I think the law was passed maybe in 1912 or 1913, I think 1913 the law was passed, so the bank was supposed to come into existence, and did come into existence in 1914. The idea was, well, you know, we haven't had, the reason they passed it is there were these things, and I guess some people thought it was Marx's predictions coming true, but there were these bank panics in the United States. And a lot of people, this is where this whole idea of a business cycle came in. There aren't really business cycles, but it seemed that there were bank panics in years ending in 7 and 3. 1907, 1893, 1883, 1887, you know, and they were fairly frequent, they seemed sort of secular. So we decided, and you know, a lot of other countries had central banks. The United States decided they would have a central bank. Most other countries, the central bank is just works for the Secretary of Treasury. That's not the case in the US. It's set up and it's quasi-independent. So we put these 12 reserve banks in, so who's gonna get the 12 reserve banks? Well, it's not, well, first of all, let me backtrack. Why is 1914 a bad time to set up a central bank?
World War I.
Yeah, what's the purpose of a central bank? Sound money. When do you want cheap money?
During the war.
When, if you're gonna fight a war, right? Because you're already taxing people and sending them off to get shot at. You better steal their money quietly by having inflation, which is what happened in a lot of countries around the world during the First World War. So, we've got this central bank, we're setting it up, and you gotta say, all right, so what are the important cities in America in 1913, 1912, when this stuff is being negotiated? Right, so, first of all, what city isn't there a reserve bank in? Washington, D.C. Why? Washington, D.C. is tiny. The federal government is tiny. It doesn't matter that much. But clearly, what's the number one city you're gonna have one in? See, we
New
need-
York.
Well, yeah, certainly New York.
Houston.
Certainly none in Houston.
Chicago.
There was one in Chicago.
Boston.
Yeah, Boston, because they think they're more important than New York, right?
There's not one in New Orleans, is there?
There is not. You're forgetting something. What is true in 1912, 1913?
Railroads.
50 years ago, those jerks in the South were shooting at my grandfather. Right? The South is not very popular for a long time after the Civil War. And in fact, any baseball fans in here? In fact, there's this guy, Ty Cobb, that comes along from Georgia, the Georgia Peach. And he's a really, really good baseball player. And probably his importance is greater than even his baseball skills, which he was one of the best ever. And that he was probably the first national hero from the South after the Civil War. Right? Because it's easy not to like the person that was shooting at your grandfather or your father or that killed your own. And it's easy, it's easy to harbor a grudge there. So, not a lot of these in the South. There are 2 of these in the South, though. But what have we got? Boston, New York, Chicago. Where else on the East Coast might we have them? Philadelphia. Again, another city that thinks it's more important than New York. Well, Philly doesn't have like the chip on his shoulder that Boston, Boston's got all these fancy educational institutions, so somehow the average janitor in Boston thinks he's smarter than any of the rest of us, I guess. And what was that movie? Or some janitor in Cambridge, Massachusetts? Really smart. Good Will Hunting. So, 2 in Missouri. Why? St. Louis and Kansas City. So
Gateway to
where's
the west.
Gateway to the west and the cattle drives, and that's why the one in Texas is
Dallas.
Dallas, because cattle, oil didn't matter that much
Yeah.
yet. You know, it was starting to. The Pennsylvania oil boom was already occurring. So that we're at 7. Atlanta and Richmond, so there were 2 in the south, you can't ignore the south completely.
I thought Virginia,
Richmond,
yeah.
yeah. Although the Richmond one almost ended up in Baltimore, and almost ended up in Charlotte, there was a big battle over it, I know a little bit. So we got 3 more we need. San Francisco, yeah, why not Los Angeles? Like,
Because,
1,000 people lived there, and it was orange groves.
yeah,
No movie boom yet. And so San Francisco gets us to 10. Minneapolis, did I say Minneapolis? Minneapolis, and we're missing one. Which one are we missing?
Is there one in Detroit?
There was not one in Detroit, which is really interesting. Why? Detroit might benefit from having it now. But I think when a lot of these things were done institutionally in the early part of the 20th century, the auto boom was taking place and Detroit didn't feel the need for it. So let me go through them again. New York, Boston, Philly, oh, Cleveland. Cleveland's the missing one. All those Midwest cities, you know, they were all booming, but they all were looking to boom, except I guess Detroit, you know, just thought, well, we're just gonna be rich forever, because they were really rich.
do you want us to know these for the test?
What do you think?
No, but just gonna ask, make sure.
Yeah. Am I the type of guy, you've had 2 of my tests, am I gonna say true, false, New Orleans had a reserve bank? And they had a satellite reserve bank, so that is now one of these secure storage area, they turned that
Yeah.
building. I think they still have a satellite version
I'm
of that.
studying the pre-Civil War, and I could say more if they had had the central bank pre-Civil War.
Yeah, no,
Would've
Frisco,
been in New
yeah,
Orleans.
there are a lot of places that make sense, but again, you know, you're giving out things that are gonna cause a flow of money. You know, it's like placing military bases, right?
Yeah,
You know, in the lead up to World War I, they placed a lot of military bases in the South, but that's because land was cheap. It wasn't as expensive elsewhere. Anyway, so, all right, so, the Fed is the U.S. central bank. We set up these reserve banks, and sort of what happened was we ended up with 12, the reserve banks had governors. And we ended up with 12 monetary policies, because each of them was pretty independent. Well, you know, and maybe that was okay for 1913. Maybe that was right for 1913. You could even make an argument today that it would be better to have a monetary policy of Toronto, Montreal, Boston, New York, Philly, Atlanta, and Vancouver, Seattle, LA, San Francisco, San Diego. That sort of, it's, you know, that the economies, you could make an argument that the economies in North America are bi-coastal. You know, there's long been an argument that maybe, you know, Northern Italy is very industrial and Southern Italy isn't, and that some of the problem they had back before the euro in controlling money was that the sound money people and the cheap money people fought with each other. In fact, that's some of the thing in the United States, right? We ended up with a central bank. That was a big battle. I think, have I mentioned William Jennings Bryan in here before? The last person to give a speech at a U.S. political convention and get the presidential nomination was William Jennings Bryan. He was talking about monetary policy, and the famous tagline from that speech is, "Thou shalt not crucify mankind on a cross of gold." He was a cheap money guy. He was the poor people's, we want cheap to borrow cheaply to get our businesses started to go west, if people were still migrating. So we had all these governors, and that didn't work very well. And of course, what happened? Soon we had World War I. And then World War I, we had 10 years of growth. Well, we had a depression right after World War I, but it was V-shaped, 1920, 21, it was that. Then we go 8 years, and then what happens? 8, 9 years, the start of the Great Depression. Maybe some of the problem with the Great Depression is the 12 different monetary policies, but at least they restructured the Fed. So the current structure of the Fed is it has a board of governors. Well, really, any human resource management majors in here? No one wants to admit to that? This is really a good human resource management major lesson. They were going to take some power away from the Reserve Bank governors. So, if you're going to take some power away from somebody, what do you want to do? Because what happens when you take power away from people? They don't like it, right? It just pisses them off, right? So, a good human relations management trick is to, when you take away power from somebody, give them a fancy new title. So, we take these Reserve Bank governors and change them into presidents. And set up in Washington a board of governors. Governors. Now maybe on top, maybe I have late 20th century, early 21st century bias in that tale I just told you. Because in reality, maybe the human resource management stuff is true, but maybe president wasn't such a good title, right? Because the most powerful people in the United States in those times were who? The governors of the however many states. I guess it got, I don't know, were we at 46 then, or I don't remember when Arizona and New Mexico, they were sort of the last before Alaska and Hawaii, I think. But the governors had a lot of power, and of course, that's an easier story to tell you than it was 5 years ago, right? Why do you understand that the governors have more power than people did 5 years ago? You lived through COVID, right? Of all the red states, we probably were among the more strict with COVID. Why? We elected an ancient woman with lung problems governor. Right? Of all the times not to have an ancient person with lung problems governor, it's probably during COVID, right? Because it's just natural, right? You can't help but think, well, I would want to shut down everything, right? You know,
Yeah, but the one running against her out of Tuscaloosa, he's bad too.
well, I understand.
It was
I'm
just
not
bad,
saying that.
bad.
Well, she was actually, she wasn't elected at that time, was she? She was, she succeeded whoever they kicked out.
Bentley,
Yeah.
that was my dermatologist in high school.
All right, so the Board of Governors, 7 members, 14-year, term limited at 1 term. So you can serve 12 years, and that's it. Appointed by the U.S. President. Confirmed by the Senate. Appointed by the U.S. President. U.S. President is important in this. Why? Because we got these 12 Reserve Bank presidents we have to distinguish the U.S. President from. So they can only serve 14 years and they're out. Chair serves a 4-year term as chair. We got a chair. And the chair is sort of like the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. The first among equals, right? How many votes does Justice Robert have in the Supreme Court? One out of, is it 7? 9. 5 fourths. 9. 1 out of 9. So, if the other power that he has is if he's in the majority. If he's in the majority decision, he gets to determine who writes the opinion. So sometimes, I guess in history, Chief Justices have voted ways they disagreed with so they can give the weakest writer the chance to write a weak opinion. So it might get overturned later, I don't know. But the chair of the Fed doesn't have any particular power other than the other 7 members. They go testify before Congress. In 1980, President Carter appointed a non-economist chair of the Fed, and we got lots of inflation. And in 2017 or 18, whenever it was, President Trump appointed a non-economist chair of the Fed, and we got lots of inflation. So that might be a warning. I don't know, there were oil price shocks in the late 70s, there was COVID this time around. You can make cases the other way around, but I generally think probably an economist should be chair of the Fed. And then there's something called the Federal Open Market Committee. And again, there are some hard things in this, so knowing things like this, that's pretty easy, anyone can do it. FOMC. It's made up of seven members of the Board of Governors, the New York Reserve Bank President, four other Reserve Bank presidents, on a rotating basis. These are the voting members. How many reserve banks are there? How many? 12, you can say it. So if we take away the New York Federal Reserve Bank president, because he's always on the committee, how many are we left with? 11. You divide 11 by 4, and what do you get?
Not an even number.
Not an integer. It is actually an odd number, but it's not an integer. So you don't get an integer. So as it turns out, probably due to the politics of the 30s, when this was done, I don't know exactly how this ended up, but there are groups of 3 that they rotate on every third year, or they have a vote every third year. They're all on the committee, but they have a vote every third year. Except for Cleveland and Philly that have a vote every other year. Right, they're on every other year, so that makes it work out. Again, I'm not gonna ask you about those, but it's just interesting to know. All right, so I'll shut up and we can, come in